Welcome to the Latter-day Freemen podcast, a podcast dedicated to building a movement of Latter-day Saints united in defense of the principles of freedom and our inspired Constitution. I'm your host, Jacob Hibbard, and I am joined as I am each week by my fellow Freemen, by Tyson Hardcastle and Jeremy Anderson. One of the things that we talk about a lot on the Latter-day Freemen podcast and on our website is the importance of learning true principles and going to sources of true principles. And on our website, we have a Start Here page. And at the bottom of it, there are a list of some books that we feel that any person who wants to better understand the principles of freedom should read. And one of these books, and this is my personal favorite book. I think this is the book that everyone should read if they're after the scriptures. To me, this book is the one book every person should read. And that is The Law by Frederic Bastiat. It was published in 1850. He's a French philosopher and economist. He was a lover and admirer of the founding fathers of the United States. And in my opinion, one of the best explainers or teachers of true principles. And the law, in my opinion, is where he's at his best. Each of us have reread the law in preparation for today's podcast. I kind of wanted to open up to each of you, up to the group. What would you say the thesis of the law is? What's Bastiat's main argument or idea?
All right, well, I guess I'll dive in. So the main argument, I think, is that, in essence, what is wrong can be codified into law and thereby be passed off as correct for the general body of a population. So let me go ahead. I picked out a quote that I think kind of summed it up, and he's much better at explaining it than I am. It is not true that the legislature has absolute power over our persons and property. The existence of persons and property preceded the existence of the legislator, and his function is only to guarantee their safety. Since law necessarily requires the support of force, its lawful domain is only in the area where the use of force is necessary. This is justice. Every individual has the right to use force for lawful self-defense. It is for this reason that the collective force, which is only the organized combination of the individual forces, may lawfully be used for the same purpose, and it cannot be used legitimately for any other purpose. Law is solely the organization of the individual right of self-defense, which existed before the law was formalized. Law is justice. So that goes into a lot more than what I was saying, but in essence, our rights existed before laws existed, and the law is derivative of the existence of those rights and meant to protect and preserve those rights. And as soon as it starts infringing on those rights, it has been perverted and it has been weaponized to essentially make it so people can break or violate our rights under the pretense that it's okay because it's law. I think I've heard said before that I guess I haven't heard it said. I don't know where this came from, actually, I guess. But the idea that we are civilized people and based off of, like, look at our laws, look at all of the things that we've developed as people. And I think that's such a contradiction. It's like the more laws we have, it seems like we're less civilized. We shouldn't have to be told in every instance what is right and what is wrong. Not even God wants to do that. He lets us govern ourselves after we've been taught correct principles, but we seem to gravitate towards that as people, it seems.
Listening to your quote, I actually found another quote in here that I feel like captures what Bastiat's thesis would be in my estimation. He says, what is law? What ought it to be? What is its scope, its limits? Logically, at what point do the just powers of the legislator stop? I do not hesitate to answer. Law is the common force organized to act as an obstacle of injustice. In short, law is justice. And in your quote, Tyson, you quoted him. I mean, he says law is justice a number of times in the book, but you quoted him as saying also, it can't be used to organize anything else. because when it is, it ceases to be just. And that's what I feel like the thesis of the book was as I was reading it. Law is justice, and it can't do anything else, or else it ceases to be just, and it goes beyond its scope.
Yeah, I had similar to both of you. A different passage that I thought of was the main idea, and it's where he says the law is the organization of natural law of lawful defense. It is the substitution of a common force for individual forces, and this common force is to do only what individual forces have a natural and lawful right to do, to protect persons, liberties, and properties, to maintain the right of each, and to cause justice to reign over us all. So again, that idea of justice, but I think he gives even more definition to what justice is. And justice is the defending of equally of the rights of all, and the securing of rights. And the reason why, to what you were saying, Jeremy, and what you were saying, Tyson, about why law can't organize or do certain things beyond securing rights, is because as soon as it does that, it exceeds its moral bounds that it derives because it is created by us as individuals. We as individuals possess the right to use force, and Bastiat talks a lot about this. We have the natural right to use physical force to protect our lives, our liberties, our properties, or he uses the faculties a lot in the essay. And if then we come together and form a government or a common force that will protect all of our rights constantly, as opposed to each of us having to do it on our own, that creation has to be bound by the same rules, moral laws that our individual use of force is bound by. And President Benson actually taught this principle as well in his talk, The Proper Role of Government, and in the Constitution, The Heavenly Banner. He said, this means then that the proper function of government is limited only to those spheres of activity within which the individual citizen has the right to act. By deriving its just powers from the governed, government becomes primarily a mechanism of defense against bodily harm, theft, and involuntary servitude. It cannot claim the power to redistribute the wealth or force reluctant citizens to perform acts of charity against their will. Government is created by man. No man possesses such power to delegate. The creature cannot exceed the creator. In general terms, therefore, the proper role of government includes such defensive activities as maintaining national, military, and local police forces for protection against loss of life, loss of property, and loss of liberty at the hands of either foreign despots or domestic criminals. So you get that second witness from President Benson of this truth that because law is force, whenever the government or the law says this is so, or if you do this, you've done something wrong or you've broken the law, force is what's going to come in and make you obey that law or punish you for breaking that law. It has to be governed by moral laws that determine when force is justified. And I think that kind of bleeds then into all of the examples and aspects of society that he talks about later on of, he says it's wrong to do this. Well, what's the reason? It all comes back to, well, force isn't morally justified in that circumstance.
Yeah, I really appreciate that Jeremy, you mentioned that he says that law is justice several times throughout the essay. And I actually think it's kind of cool because in our theology, justice and mercy play central roles to our theology. And for me, reading this, it's very evident that law occupies only the space of justice and does not encroach in or trespass over the law going into mercy. It's only that part in justice.
One of the things that stood out to me when I was reading about the law, as he describes it, he's talking about human law. He's talking about law that's created by us in our governments. And I think there's actually a distinction. When you read in the scriptures, they also talk about law. Lehi talks about law when he's teaching Jacob, I think. in 2nd Nephi chapter 2. And he teaches that without law, you would have no punishment, and without punishment, you couldn't have any righteousness. Without righteousness, you could have no wickedness. But and everything would be compound in one. It's a different kind of law, though. There's, I think, a distinction between human law and eternal law that that's important to make there.
I don't know if I would say distinction, more of like human law and the laws that we're talking about here, and like what the proper role of government is a subcategory of divine law. Like I wouldn't, and maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, Jeremy, because I wouldn't say that the kind, like the principle of what law is that Bastiat is talking about is somehow different or opposed to God's laws. It's just, I think it's more that God's laws are more expansive. We should be careful to not say like, oh, well, these are just lesser principles or lesser laws that aren't really, that only apply to mankind in certain circumstances, when I think that you can see evidence that God himself abides by similar, if not higher versions of these same kind of principles.
No, yeah, I totally agree with you, Jacob. It's where Bastiat says there is in all of us a strong disposition to believe that anything lawful is also legitimate. What I thought was interesting is that when we look at the laws that humans make, I think we can easily confuse them with laws that God has given us. And that's why we have this tendency, if something's legal, we think it's also legitimate. We think it's also moral and right. And it's not the case.
And in America, we have an added benefit, I think, of when it comes to our Constitution, we do have divine influence in our man-made laws. In Section 101 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the Savior says, that he established the Constitution through wise men whom he raised up. And then in Section 98, he's talking about the law and the constitutional law of the land. He says, and that law of the land which is constitutional, supporting that principle of freedom and maintaining rights and privileges, belongs to all mankind and is justifiable before me. Therefore, I, the Lord, justify you and your brethren of my church in befriending that law which is the constitutional law of the land. And as pertaining to law of man, whatsoever is more or less than this cometh of evil. I, the Lord God, make you free. Therefore ye are free indeed, and the law also maketh you free. And so it's just another witness or of that concept of laws of men, constitutional law. When we're talking about law in the context of Bastiat's The Law, its purpose is to maintain rights and privileges, to secure rights, to make us free, so that we're free to choose, that we're free to enjoy our rights. And in Doctrine and Covenants, Section 134, again, it's even more detail about our view on law, where it says in verse 2, we believe that no government can exist in peace except such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure to each individual the free exercise of conscience, the right and control of property, and the protection of life. So again, in our own scriptures, we see the articulation of the same principle that Bastiat teaches about the importance of law securing life, liberty, and property, or life, faculties, and property, as Bastiat calls it.
So I find it interesting. I kind of cut out, guys. You guys lost me for a second, so I'm not sure if I'm completely caught up on the conversation. But on this topic, I think we're still on. My mind keeps on going back to a part in the law where Bastiat explains that the law is not creating justice. The law is preventing injustice from occurring. And so if we're still talking about this concept of, is it the same as God's law, or does it operate in the same as God's law? I'm wondering if there's something more to that, where God's law will describe how things are created and how things evolve and how we can become better and expand ourselves. Whereas what I'm seeing as like man's law, or the analog of maybe a higher law, but here on earth, this law that we abide by or that we behave by is kind of keeping us from causing injustice, but isn't necessarily causing us to become more. And I don't know if there's, I'm just kind of limiting my thoughts because I'm dwelling on this one thought, or if there's more to it as it pertains to this discussion.
No, I think you're hitting on something, and I recall the part that you're talking about where he talks about law being justice. He said, as a friend of mine once remarked, this negative concept of law is so true that the statement, the purpose of the law is to cause justice to reign, is not rigorously accurate statement. It ought to be stated that the purpose of the law is to prevent injustice from reigning. In fact, it is injustice instead of justice that has an existence of its own. Justice is only achieved when injustice is absent. And so I think it goes back to that idea that you were expressing, is that the purpose of law in terms of civil law government is to prevent injustice. And what is an injustice? Violating the rights of somebody else, using physical force to deprive someone of their life, their liberty, or their property. And in that sphere, bringing in the gospel perspective, what President Oak said, we have our moral agency, and that moral agency thrives or is best expressed in a situation of maximum freedom. That is what the law does. By preventing injustice, violations of our natural rights, it creates that environment of maximum freedom for individuals to exercise their moral agency. So one thing that I really loved about the law from the first time that I read it is that Bastiat does a really good job of giving us tools or toolkits, as I like to think about it, to evaluate and to identify good policy and bad policy. And so as you guys have studied the law, what are some of those tools that Bastiat gives in the law that helps us identify good policy that's in line with the proper role of government and policy that is not?
So one that stood out really clearly to me, he says, but how is this legal plunder to be identified? Quite simply, see if the law takes from some persons what belongs to them and gives to other persons to whom it does not belong. See if the law benefits one citizen at the expense of another by doing what the citizen himself cannot do without committing a crime. And yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty simple, right? Like, if I want education, I want to go to school, I couldn't just bust down Jacob's door, rob him at gunpoint so I could go pay for my education, right? I couldn't even bust down his door or politely knock on the door and insist that he gives me his money. That's not within my rights. I mean, I can try and draw on our friendship and say, hey, you got money, I don't, send me to school, but I can't force him to do that. And so it would be wrong for me to, get a bunch of my buddies and then come show up at Jacob's house and under duress force him to give me his life savings so I could go to school.
It would not be a very big sum. So go after Jeremy. He's a former business owner. He'll have much more goods to be plundered if you're going about plundering. But
he's in Alaska, man. I can't do that. It's too far. I'd spend more money going there. So you're my easiest victim. Sorry.
That's probably true. But I agree. I think that it's a really powerful tool of, okay, is the government taking from one group of people or one person and giving it to somebody else in society? That is, I think, is a really simple evaluative tool that Bastiat gives. Another one that I like is he says that force has been given us to defend our own rights. Who will dare to say that force has been given to us to destroy the equal rights of our brothers? Since no individual acting separately can lawfully use force to destroy the rights of others, does it not logically follow that the same principle also applies to the common force that is nothing more than the organized combination of the individual forces? So again, this concept of, okay, if we're using force and force is governed by certain moral principles, that being that it is morally justified to secure our rights from threats to them, then when we look at a policy, whatever it might be that government's going to do, we can ask ourselves, is this to secure rights? Or even more simply, if I was to do this on my own, would I be morally justified in doing that? And so that evaluative question is this securing rights? Is this the proper use of force, morally justified force, I think that's a really helpful tool that we can use as well.
I really love that tool because it cleared up for me the first time I read the law a question that a specific question about a policy. There's this idea that we have of progressive taxation, where you take from, it's essentially it's Robin Hood. We take from the rich and we give to the poor because the poor need it more and the rich have plenty. And so we just take it from them and, equalize things a little bit. But if you think about it from this perspective of protecting rights, the function of the law and the kind of government we tried to set up in America is one where if I have earned something, if I own something, that's mine and you can't take it from me. If I go to somebody that has $1 million and I say, look, you've got $1 million and I've only got $10, you need to give me, you don't even have to give me half, just give me $100,000 and we're even. I can't do that. And why should the government be able to do that? It's no more just to take that from them because the government's doing it than it is if I do it personally. And so I really, really like that tool. I think it's a really powerful one. Another one that I saw is further down. He's talking about the socialist worldview. He says, socialists look upon people as raw material to be formed into social combinations. This is so true that if by chance the socialists have any doubts about the success of these combinations, they will demand that a small portion of mankind be set aside to experiment upon. He talks in depth about this viewpoint of people as being raw material and the legislator being the one that forms society and gives direction and energy and impetus to the people in society, which is a stark contrast against the viewpoint that he puts forward and that we hold as members of the Church of Jesus Christ, that men are agents and women are agents to act for themselves and not to be acted upon. And so when you are confronted with people that are arguing for different policies or different positions, you can ask yourself, how are they seeing their fellow man? Are they seeing them as agents who have responsibility for themselves, or are they seeing them as an object to be saved, to be fixed, or to be pulled down, whatever it is?
I think alongside that point of view, Jeremy, I think something that people really struggle with is when you begin to think of people as agents and you allow them the room to be agents, then you do have to accept that not everything is going to run all pretty. There will be mishap and there will be tragedy and there will be opportunities for people to learn. Not everybody's going to make the right choice all the time. Now, of course, if that's violating somebody's right, that's where the law steps in to try and stop it. But if that just means that somebody is not donating to a social, healthcare, that's something that we have to allow to happen so that people have the chance to learn and to grow. If we force that, then people are robbed of the chance to come to the realization and conviction that we are meant to help each other out. And that's the only way that we can learn and grow. And so with the law in place, with the law restricting or violating our rights, going beyond its proper place and bound, that comes at the expense of human growth, the advancement of our race, our species. The order that we seek so earnestly through these social laws is at the expense of our ultimate growth and advancement as mankind.
And as H. Rowan Anderson talks about, Elder H. Rowan Anderson in Many Are Called But Few Are Chosen, he outlines how when you do that, you not only deprive people of the things that you said, but we can't merit blessing for good acts that are forced by law, and we can't really merit punishment if the government prevents us from taking an action that while it might be sinful, wouldn't violate on the rights of other people. And so law going beyond its bounds spiritually is an impediment as well to our spiritual growth, our spiritual progress, which is why President McKay, in his talk on the present war, talks about how defending agency is so important and protecting individual liberty is so important that God would pay the cost of war to protect agency. And when we have the law, instead of protecting our agency or securing this space for us to exercise it, it infringes on it. We have so many problems in all sorts of ways, from material problems to spiritual problems.
Yeah, Bastiat also has a similar quote, Jacob. He says, perhaps the politician should ask himself whether the state of affairs has not been caused by old conquests and lootings and by more recent legal plunder. Perhaps he should consider this proposition. Since all persons seek well-being and perfection, would not a condition of justice be sufficient to cause the greatest efforts toward progress and the greatest possible equality that is compatible with individual responsibility? Would not this be in accord with the concept of individual responsibility which God has willed in order that mankind may have the choice between vice and virtue and the resulting punishment and reward?
Another insight that I really like from Bastiat is talking about he says that, he identifies how you find legal plunder, and then says, as soon as this happens, get rid of it as fast as possible, because as soon as people have legal plunder, they look at their plunder as rights. And then he says, the person who profits from this law will complain bitterly when you're trying to get rid of the law that plunders. He says, it will complain bitterly, defending his acquired rights. He will claim that the state is obligated to protect and encourage his particular industry, that this procedure enriches the state because the protected industry is thus able to spend more and to pay higher wages to the poor working man. Do not listen to this sophistry of vested interests. The acceptance of these arguments will build legal plunder into a whole system. In fact, this has already occurred. The present-day delusion is an attempt to enrich everyone at the expense of everyone else, to make plunder universal under the pretense of organizing it. And then he gives a list of different types of plunder, which he lists tariffs, protection, benefits, subsidies, encouragements, progressive taxation, public schools, guaranteed jobs, guaranteed profits, minimum wages, a right to relief, a right to the tools of labor, free credit, and so on. All these plans as whole, with their common aim of legal plunder, constitute socialism. And I think that in our own society, you see this a lot. If you want to get a bunch of boomers mad, talk about getting rid of Social Security. If you want to get certain people upset, talk about getting rid of Medicare, Medicaid, and some of these other welfare programs that we have. For my job, going up and being part of the legislative session, and if you want to touch any of these kinds of benefits or these types of legal plunder that we have, be it minimum wage, tariffs, any of these things, you'll be shocked. Or this last legislative session here in Utah, there was licensing laws that prevented people from braiding hair or washing and drying and styling hair without a certain license. And as soon as we looked at trying to change that law so that people would be able to exercise that natural right they have to, if somebody wants somebody to braid their hair and they want to give them money for it, to wash somebody's hair, and someone wants to give them money for it, as soon as we touched that, this huge uproar. I had a senator tell me that bill was the bill he heard the most, got the most letters from people about, because they wanted to protect that perceived right that they had to their protected turf. Anyway, I just say that insight, I think, we see all of the time in society, and his warning, unfortunately, we haven't heeded. We didn't get rid of it right away. We've listened to the sophistry of vested interest, and we've created this entire system of different types of plunder and people competing for ways to plunder each other.
Well, and I think it's good to mention, I shared a quote, I think it was in the first quote I shared, he talked about how as we allow the law to expand, it becomes a burden for us to bear. And I find that to be so. I heard something the other day that, and I don't know how true this is, but I think it's at least a good thought or exercise, thought exercise. The most dangerous intersections are those that have the most protective measures in place. And that's, the idea behind that statement would be that people are so, rely so much on these protective measures that they forget to look both ways themselves. And so they see the green light go on and they think, oh, it's all safe for me to go. But they didn't know that somebody was going to run that red light and hit them. And so we begin to lose our own faculties, and we expect everybody else to bear that for us. And if they don't, then we, expect to sue or to, go after our right. I had a right to walk. I think it's kind of an interesting contrast when you walk up, you go hiking or something like that, and you see a sign that says "Don't feed the bears." And the idea behind that is that they will become very reliant on your food, and it will actually hurt them as a species if they rely on that source of food. And then we turn around and we allow the same to happen for each other. We begin helping people rely on welfare programs and stuff like that, not even thinking of how much damage it's causing to our species.
I think it's interesting you bring up the example of the bears, Tyson. In Anchorage and surrounding areas, the problem isn't so much that you're worried about harming the bears as a species because they become reliant on human food. The problem is they realize that human food is there, and they start coming around looking for trash. And once they realize that they can eat trash out of people's garbage cans, it's really, really hard to get rid of them without just shooting them. They've tried many things, and bears are actually very intelligent, and they start to realize, oh, I can press this button and that opens up the garbage can when you have it bear locked, and I can figure out different ways. And so the same thing happens as when we as a people start to realize, oh, I can plunder. I don't have to work for myself. I can get what I want from somebody else. And if we start to rely on that method of taking care of our basic needs, then we get really ingenious about it, and we get really persistent. We have a lot of creative energy, and we use it all to plunder other people instead of to create our own ecosystem, create what we need for ourselves.
And unfortunately, we use the law to do it, which gives it the veneer of legitimacy when we do that. And it also, Bastiat says, creates unnatural interest in politics, because then everyone's fighting over the government stick to use to either plunder somebody else or to try to respond to a previous thrust of plunder that somebody else did. And talks about how we'd all care about politics a lot less if we actually kept the government and the law restricted to its proper role. One last thing that I wanted to highlight, the source of the drivers of where legal plunder comes from. And according to Bastiat, he says the law has been perverted by the influence of two entirely different causes: stupid greed and false philanthropy. And I thought that was really insightful, and I think that remains true in our own society. I think the second one first, the false philanthropy, I think there's a lot of good people who want to do good things, who in their heart of hearts are trying to accomplish good things. They have that philanthropy, but when they choose to use government to accomplish that philanthropy, it becomes false philanthropy. It becomes injustice. It becomes violations of rights and moral. And that's really damaging and really harmful despite their best intentions. And then on the other hand, the stupid greed. If I know I can use the law to plunder other people, like you've been talking about, if I can push that button, so to speak, that's going to just keep happening, and that greed's just going to grow.
Yeah, I think the idea of false philanthropy is a pretty complex issue, but I think part of philanthropy requires that, or necessitates, or maybe it just allows for, the ultimate well-being of the individuals involved. And when you involve the law, that again restricts how much growth can actually be experienced by everybody involved with that philanthropy.
Well, we've been going on for a little while. Hopefully folks feel like they got an idea of some of the awesome ideas in the law, and we've inspired them to want to read it. Because like I said, I think it's the one book everybody should read at least once. To close, I wanted to share Bastiat's closing words to the law, and I find them really inspiring. He said, "God has given to men all that is necessary for them to accomplish their destinies. He has provided a social form as well as a human form, and these social organs of persons are so constituted that they will develop themselves harmoniously in the clean air of liberty. Away then with quacks and organizers, away with their rings, chains, hooks, and pincers, away with their artificial systems, away with the whims of governmental administrators, their socialized projects, their centralization, their tariffs, their government schools, their state religions, their free credit, their bank monopolies, their regulations, their restrictions, their equalization by taxation, and their pious moralizations. And now that the legislators and do-gooders have so futilely inflicted so many systems upon society, may they finally end where they should have begun. May they reject all systems and try liberty, for liberty is an acknowledgement of faith in God and his works." And to me, that just is super powerful and inspiring.
Sorry, your thought there reminded me of something that I think is worth mentioning too, that Bastiat kind of throws into this, which I think is really important for anybody who finds themselves on this stage. Anybody that's these ideas are resonating with them. Bastiat does go in and say, "I do not mean to attack the intentions of or the morality of anyone. Rather, I am attacking an idea which I believe to be false, a system which appears to me to be unjust. An injustice so independent of personal intentions that each of us profits from it without wishing to do so and suffers from it without knowing the cause of the suffering." And so I will say there are a lot of people out there, even in the church, who are fighting for these laws for socialism to take root. The vast majority of people who are doing this are doing so out of good intentions. They think that's the way. They think they're following Christ's teachings. And so any sort of redress or any sort of appeal to them that makes them out to be the bad guy, that puts them in the darkest of light, is a very unjust thing to do, a very unfair thing to do, and we should not do that in any of our dialogue. It does not help change people's hearts, and it does not bring people closer to Christ. They are acting in their best understanding of the light of Christ.
I hope that everyone will take some time to read the law. There's so much in there that we didn't get to. And honestly, it's not a long book, and it's not a hard read. Bastiat was a master with simple and clear explanation.
And sometimes he's really snarky, and it's really funny, and I love it. Well, folks, I hope that you guys have enjoyed this podcast. I hope that it's been inspiring, and that at the very least inspires you to read the law. And I hope that we as Latter-day Saints can move ourselves towards trying liberty and getting government and getting the law back to its proper function of securing our rights, securing our liberties, so that we can breathe the free air of liberty. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Be sure also to share this podcast with your friends and with your family. If you know someone who's like-minded, who's interested in politics, share this with them. Get their thoughts on it. We'd love to hear from you. You can contact us on our Facebook page, on Twitter, or on Instagram. We're on all three of those platforms. Or you can email the show directly at latterdayfreeman76@gmail.com. And if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe on YouTube, or give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Podcast Addict, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. Well, for Jeremy and for Tyson, thank you again, and we will see you next week.